So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gavin Jackson. I'm a correspondent with The Economist, and I'd like to welcome you all to a panel on getting the right data to tackle climate change. Credible data is critical to better understand the implications of a warming planet, while missing data makes it harder to design and monitor effective mitigation, adaptation, and transitional policies. But it's not only about the data, it's how you use it. There's an urgent need to not only to address these gaps, but also to integrate them into decision-making at all levels of society. So we all know the scale of the challenge. Greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut by 43% by 2030, compared to 2019 levels, if you want to have any chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. According to the latest IMF estimates, achieving net zero by 2050 requires an average annual investment of $3.5 trillion per year until 2030. Climate adaptation costs vary across countries, ranging from 0.25% of global GDP to 20% of GDP for climate-vulnerable countries. That finance is increasing, but not at the pace we need. So as noted by the IMF Managing Director at the 9th IMF Statistical Forum, in order to track the path to net zero, we need to understand the risks that climate change is and list appropriate action. Governments need the right data. So that's what we'll be discussing today. And to discuss these issues, we've brought together policymakers and statisticians. First, let me introduce Rylén Bekkers, Special Representative of the Minister for Climate Action in the Netherlands, and also co-chair Sherpa for the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. She is joined by Lalia Ali Kamara, who is Minister of the Environment for Mauritania, and prior to her current post was also Minister responsible for Sustainable Development. From the World Bank, we have Stefan Helgate, Senior Climate Change Advisor, and to round out our panel, I would like to welcome Bert Gozer, Chief Statistician at the International Monetary Fund and former Chair of the UN Committee of Experts on Environmental and Economic Accounts. So Bert, let's start with you. The IMF considers climate change to be what it calls macro-relevant, and is impacting all lines of your work, from research, surveillance to lending, and even statistics. What are the main data gaps that limit our ability to develop policy to transition to net zero?
Well, thanks, Gavin. As you say, climate change is central to the mandate of the IMF. We see it as a threat to financial stability and economic growth. And because it's central, there's also a need for good data. But unfortunately, there are large data gaps, and this is different from regular economic and financial policy making. Even some of the most advanced economies have not mainstreamed the collection and production of environment and climate data in their statistical systems, and even less integrated these data with economic data. What we have developed, and you can see that here on the slide, as the Statistics Department, is the Climate Indicators Dashboard. And this is a platform for disseminating the climate change data that there is, relevant for macroeconomic and financial stability analysis. The Climate Indicators Dashboard is unique in the sense that it presents climate change-related macroeconomic indicators, combining existing IMF data and other data using new methodologies. So we bring together all the data that there is relevant for our work and also of the governments to devise policies on the macroeconomy and the financial field. But when putting it together, it turned out that there's also a lot of data missing. And we basically identified 3 reasons why the data are missing. First, the types of data where there's methodology developed, where we know what to do, where even the data, the basic data might be there, but not many countries are producing the data. An example is air emission data, energy accounts data, where about 50 countries producing them now. It's mandatory in the European Union, but not so many countries outside that make these statistics. And these data are essential to study the relationship between emissions and the economy. So where is the money earned? What are the emissions? Important for economic modeling. The second type of data that is missing is when there's not good classifications. For example, on subsidies and expenditures, there's a lot of data, but they're not comparable international. The data on subsidies and expenditures in one country are different from other countries. Also on climate finance statistics. We have here on the climate dashboard something called green bonds, but basically it is self-reporting by countries. You can use it in the countries, but the data is not necessarily very comparable. And still it's very important. The IMF estimates that the path to net zero by 2050 requires low carbon investment to rise from 900 billion in 2020 to 5 trillion annually by 2013. And that's only the mitigation financing needs. There's also substantial investments needed to adapt to climate change. And policymakers need to track both the source of these funds and the uses of these funds. We have a rich set of national macroeconomic and environmental data sets to help us track investment and the financing, but they're not disaggregated enough to say things specifically about climate and the environment. We will work with relevant partners, including the World Bank, to develop appropriate methodology and net granularity. The third type of data that's missing is when there's not even a clear idea what the mission and what the indicators should be. Missing methodology. For example, the information on risks are very important. I've been walking around in COP, and many countries, many meetings are about physical risk, about transition risk. There's a large interest to know more about that. So where should investments go? What should prioritization be? What are the predictions? And there's a lot of work on that. There's a lot of models. There's a lot of ideas, but there's no harmonized indicators, no harmonized methodology, and no harmonized data. Also, this will be addressed by us in cooperation with many other parties to see whether we can find some macroeconomic indicators that are relevant. So basically, there is a lot there, but not as much as it should be. This is not only the IMF missing the data, all the countries themselves, and we see basically 3 different reasons why we still don't have the data that we need. Thank you very much.
So developing countries who have historically contributed the least are also those most disproportionately affected. And so do we have the, yeah. So they're depicted here with the red dots, so the lack of coping capacity and then historical emissions. But as we see so often with climate change, not only are the worst affected, responsible, but they also have the biggest data gaps. So Minister Kamara, the IMF gave us some examples of type of data that can support climate policy, as well as some of the data gaps. In the case of Mauritania, what type of data do you need to develop policies and programs? What do you see the main challenges in your country to develop and use that data when you've got it?
Okay. Thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation. As I said this morning, we are grateful that you put Mauritania under the projectors and on the light. It's important for us to make sure that our partners understand well our needs and the gaps that you have, and especially in the data gaps. Because as we all know, it is easier to improve what you can measure. So it's important for us to have measurement means, tools, methodologies for some aspect. I can say that on the temperature, for instance, we don't have enough measures. On the greenhouse gases, on the sea level, all those challenges that we have and that we have to improve in terms of adaptation of our population to the climate change impact. In Mauritania, we have an agency that is specialized on the statistic, but they are, I will say, a burden. The work that they have is enough for them on the population data, but also economical data. So it's difficult to put above that the environmental data. So for us, the need is there, and it's in all aspects. As I said, we have forest. We have 30 forests before 1960, and now we have lost 70% of those forests. So it is important to see where we stand, where we were before, and where we stand today regarding the forest. It's important to see the sea level. When we say Nouakchott is in a coastal city where we have erosion, but also the risk of flooding every year. So it's important to have those references, knowing where we go, where we are, and where we want to go, and what we have to improve. So I would say that in all aspects of the environmental subject, we need data. I have to say that that's also on the magnitude of the climate-related disasters, flooding, drought. We need data also. So it's a large spectrum, and yeah, there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much. So, Ms. Beggars, the Netherlands, as a developed country with a world-class statistical service, is also facing data challenges. So what type of data gaps are there in your country?
Thank you very much for this question. So in the Netherlands and also more in the EU context, we do indeed have very advanced statistical capacities. In the Netherlands, we have For example, our Environmental Assessment Agency, we have our Central Bureau of Statistics. Those are separate government agencies dealing with the data. And they are looking, for example, at specific climate and energy data, assessing the climate policies, looking at their impacts. And the Bureau of Statistics also most recently is starting to generate data on, for example, broader well-being and the role of the SDGs. So this is actually new types of data that are really important. And within the field of policy making, for us, there's actually a lot of good quality data available, which is then used across the government policy reports, which you also saw in the recent ECOFIN report on integrating climate in finance policies from this year. But then the challenges that we face relate also to the insights that we can integrate, that we derive from those insights, from the data in government-wide decision-making processes. So we may have a lot of data generated, but then how do we actually translate it into policy actions? That's where we still see a lot of room for improvement. Then I do want to touch briefly upon the EU context as well, because it's for us very important. And specifically in the financial domain, there's data that we lack on sustainability factors, but also very much on the comparability between the data. So there's like a lot that is happening, a lot of initiatives, a lot of directives. There's the CSRD, there's also other initiatives, private sector initiatives, GFANS, SBTI. So we're generating data, but there's a lack of comparability because the approaches vary a lot. So I think that's a challenge we're now practically running into a lot, and I think that's something we need to look at because it's starting to enter into force. But then it's what does it practically means for the governments to then act upon that. So I think for us, it's really primarily in the applicability of the data, in the integration of the different approaches, and then the comparability also with other countries and other places to then make it useful. Yeah. And I think that's where in our context we face the most and where we need to look at and also work with partners on how we take the next steps based on that data.
Exactly. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, Stefan, we've now heard about the scale of the challenge. Can we hear a little bit about what the international community is doing to develop solutions? So the World Bank has developed something that's called the Climate Change Knowledge Portal. Can you tell us a little bit about this and what are the main implementation challenges to mainstream climate change data?
Yeah, I think it's a good example to complement what we just discussed, because there are cases where we don't have enough data, and we have cases where we have too much, right? And I think climate data might be one of these cases. So you go to the IPCC website and you want to download data, you get 3 terabytes of data in some very sophisticated format. There's just no way actual decisions can be made by the people who are making these decisions in cities, in communities, in companies, based on this data. You need a translation. Right. And we saw that with our teams. Our teams, so it's a huge number of PhD in economics and so on, completely at loss. What do we do with that much data? And so we created the Climate Change Knowledge Portal to try to translate, simplify, keeping enough expertise to know when too much simplification becomes a bad thing and dangerous. So you need to just decide how simple you're ready to make your data. And the CCKP is the result of this work, working with our teams. And now we realize it also meets the needs of a lot of the people on the front line that we're talking with every day. And so different people will be interested in different things. Sometimes it's sectoral, so we have information at the sectoral level on agriculture, water management, and so on. Some people will be interested in extreme events, so you have different things for extreme events. We have country profile when you have to get a sense of a context. So in that case, it's all about the translation and making it usable, which is very often very important. In some cases, we cannot do that because the data is not there. And even in some cases, we don't even have the definition of the data. I mean, carbon price or even the subsidies, it's a good example where not everybody agrees on how we define a carbon price or a subsidy. But I feel already with the data we have, there is a lot of work to make it easier to use. And I want to give you just one example of how important it is to start with a decision. After disasters, you want to help people affected. And a very normal response is to start to collect data. But if you take like 3 months to collect the data before you start helping people, maybe you'll have like a great targeting, but it's just too late. A lot of the impacts are already there. So for that decision, only the data you can get like in days will matter. If you're doing a subsidy reform and you don't want it to just backfire to your face, you want to think really, really hard about distributional impacts. You might want to collect data to engage, to understand how people see that. And in that case, you can take months to collect the right data. I think if you don't start with like, the actual decision you want to inform, it's very difficult to know what you can do.
Yeah, completely, yeah. As someone who's wrestled with the IPCC, terabytes of data, that sounds fantastic to me. So, okay. So, Bert, you and Stefan have highlighted a number of these data gaps, as well as technical and institutional issues that make availability of climate data a challenge. So, can you tell us a little about what the IMF is doing to ensure that relevant data is there to help policymakers answer the questions they want to ask?
Thank you, because we really want to ensure there's better data. There might be tons of data, but indeed it also has to be usable and brought close to the policymakers. I want to mention 4 things. One is that last year in Bali, the IMF is charged by the Minister of Finance and Central Bank Governors to lead an initiative on data gaps. And lead means working together with the UN, with the OECD, the BIS, the ECB, Eurostat, World Bank, and all the G20 economies. And the 14 data gaps they identified, there were 7 on climate, 2 on inequality, and 3 on financial inclusion, digital money, and fintech. And what we're doing is trying to develop new methodologies and new data in all the climate areas together with the other international organizations to fill data for the climate dashboard and also for the countries. And this is actually quite exciting. The second thing that we're doing, on the slide you see the system of environmental economic accounting, the balance of payments, system of national accounts. We statisticians like to make statistical standards, manuals. That means complete descriptions, how you measure the economy in a structured, standardized way. For example, the system of national accounts is approved by the United Nations Statistical Commission, unanimously by all countries in the world. And there will be a revision in 2025. And 11 years ago, we approved of the system of environmental economic accounting, and this describes basically the relation between the environment and the economy. And also this was approved by all countries in the world. By working on these standards, we hope to have better agreements on, the definitions, the way we measure things, and in that way, like we do with national accounts, better comparability of data. And in the next update of System of National Accounts, there will be many more environmental things. Obviously, the whole decision-making process has not been finalized, but now the idea, for example, is to have renewable assets being part of the asset boundary, which means really something for the difference in wealth of nations. Also look at different disaggregations of financial instruments to make climate and environment much more visible. The third thing we're doing is a capacity development program. We have a lot of contact with countries on their needs on GDP data, on balance of payments data, but more and more we also hear that there's interest in climate data related to the economy, to the macroeconomy. So we're presently working with 7 countries. This is paid by the Swiss Ministry of Economic Affairs. They're blue on the slides. We're working with them to generate exactly those statistics that are needed for them. This is a pilot, and I really hope we can scale up that, and the results we get from the DGI, the G20 DGI, we can really bring to all countries in the world and not stick to the G20. And the fourth thing I want to mention here is innovation. When I walk around in the COP, data is everywhere, and this is great for a statistician like me. And also innovation is everywhere. This morning we had a panel with the European Space Agency. They're basically providing a tool using their open data and all kinds of techniques to estimate forward-looking risk indicators, to see where the economy and hazards meet each other. And this kind of cooperation, also with the academic world, with companies and institutions like ESA, is very fruitful, and also we will use that to ensure there's more and better data.
Okay, well, that all sounds very interesting. Minister Kamara, we've heard that resourcing and a lack of coordination across national and international institutions is one of the main challenges in developing and using climate change statistics. Could you tell us about how you're addressing the issue in Mauritania and what institutions like the IMF and the World Bank can do to help?
Okay. Yeah, as I said earlier, so we have an important gap of data, but I would like to add also that we have an important number of reports on biodiversity, on climate, so I can have all kinds of reports. But the problem I started this, I was appointed a year ago, and when I open those reports, I have a problem of reliability the data I have in it, on those reports. And I think that it's because of the methodology that is used, because we don't have the means, because we don't have the human resources to do that. They will use extrapolation methodology without going on ground. So sometimes it gives me figures that I cannot rely on. So yeah, I just wanted to correct that, but because you have those reports. So I think that, yeah, the first, I will say in terms of recommendation, the first recommendation I will do is collaboration between the different partners we have. But again, if I may take one example, is the wetland. I was asking to my team, okay, how many wetlands do we have in Mauritania? No answer. But we have been working on the wetland in the last 30 years, I would say, if I'm not exaggerating, because UNDP have done a work, FAO have done a work, who else? UCN have done a work, AMSEN have done a work, so we don't know exactly, and no one knows before it started the work that there were a work that had been done. So I think it's important that we have this collaboration between the different UN agencies, but also between all the partners that you are working on, so that when we start to work, we know, first of all, that who have done this work before, who have worked on this subject before. This is my first recommendation. My second recommendation is to make sure that we have terms of references that are clear for every report or for every work we're doing. Because doing the list of the wetland that we have in Mauritania is different from making a plan for each wetland. Before I make a plan for a wetland, it's important that I know its importance. So it's what type of category and the priority of this wetland. So this is an example of taking on the wetland. I don't want to criticize the Wetland Convention, but it's an example. Also, make sure that we have the means, human means, but also the resources to go on ground. Because today, when I want to have figures on my forest, as I said earlier, it's difficult for me to sit on a table, on a desk, and to pretend to have reports on the forest. It's important to have the means to go on ground. It's important to have the technology and the techniques also. So we are working with an organization called OSS to put in place a department in my ministry that will work on what is the new technologies on geomatic, satellite detection, teledetection, all those means that we can use, first of all, to see what is on ground before, because it can ease also the work. So I'm happy to hear that World Bank have an important team who's working on data that EMF also is supporting technically. I think that we will need their support. We are aware today of what we need and what we want. We have clear plans on adaptation, clear plan on biodiversity, clear plans on desertification. So it's important that we don't go on action plans that are having the means, the methodology, the techniques, and also the good human resources to do the work.
Yeah. So, Ms. Beckers, you're also involved in the Coalition for Finance Ministers for Climate Change. Can you discuss the type of data that finance ministers in particular need to navigate the climate challenge?
Yes, thank you very much. So the Netherlands is currently co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, together with Indonesia. This is a collective of over 90 countries from all different regions that come together as ministries of finance, but especially also as ministers of finance, regarding our role when it comes to climate action. And it has been around for many years, or for 4 or 5 years already. And now it's really for us time to move from talking about the topics to also the implementation. So that's where we're focusing on as the Ministries of Finance co-chairs right now, coalition co-chairs. So it has been referenced a bit, but one of the key data points that are really key for Ministries of Finance are better data on the physical and the transition risks, of course, associated with climate change and climate action. We need to understand better how those will materialize in our country contexts, because we need to be prepared also in the fiscal sense. This helps planning for climate projects, for adaptation, but it's also very important when it comes to disaster risk reduction point of view. And of course, these disasters cause enormous economic shocks. So it's very important to be aware of what it means, what climate change means in your country, and what it's going to mean to the budget, to the fiscal situation, and how you can anticipate. Because in the end, it is really about how do we then plan for it, and how can we avoid the costs that can be avoided. And especially this is, of course, a huge issue in the global south, of which many members of the coalition, of course, are based, because there we know about huge issues when it comes to debt situation, debt challenges. So this can add huge stressors to the debt burden of countries already. So having better data on what climate impacts are going to mean, and then being able to anticipate, to be able to manage and mitigate the impacts that finance ministries will have to navigate. This is really critical when it comes to climate, and this is something that still is to be integrated much more in what the Ministry of Finance currently does, because that's not necessarily the most natural thing, but it is essential as we look at the current situation of the climate crisis and where we're headed and what we need to be prepared for and what we can hopefully as much avoid, of course. Then when it comes to another really important point is that we also mainstream then this data in what the ministry is doing. So, for example, mainstream climate considerations in the macroeconomic models that we're using. And in the coalition, we're advancing this work in our work stream on mainstreaming climate in macroeconomic policies, that really also we do this in the models and in the data that we apply directly in the ministry. So that's the work that the coalition is currently advancing. Then maybe one point also on the financial sector again, because this is also important from a regulator standpoint. If you look at, for example, the net zero commitments, the financial sector transition plans, there's, like I said earlier, about the comparability, there's a lot of issues because there is data, but they're using different tools. So there are a lot of problems with how credible they actually are. So we need to look better at like these commitments and how we can make sure that the data is useful and that it is right, and that we can therefore work with the financial sector in these transition plans that are really moving towards net zero. Then related to this, also an issue on better data when it comes to credit risks. This is maybe not directly to ministries of finance, but it is impacting very much the situation on the ground when it comes to the cost of capital of many projects, especially looking again at the developing countries and how much more expensive it is, or how much harder it is to invest in the transition in countries. So as ministries of finance, there's also looking at having a dialogue with the credit rating agencies and looking at this aspect, because it's actually impeding some of the progress that we need to make on the ground, and looking at having more data sharing on the actual credit worthiness in developing countries would go a long way to accurately assess the risks, so that there is more potential for lowering the cost of capital and really investing in a transition that is urgently needed. So if you're looking at the MDBs, for example, we take the focus on the GEMS database, Global Emerging Market database, which would be a massive consideration of overview of credit events, default rates in emerging economies that we can use to better assess this. So that's another data point that's going to be critical when it comes to the developing countries and emerging market investments for the transition. So to conclude, we're here at COP28. We're talking about looking at the climate policies, the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs from the Ministry of Finance coalition. We really are looking at what is the role of Ministries of Finance in this process, because it's mostly with the environment ministries often, but we really need to make sure now that finance ministries are part of the NDCs for 2025 and of the long-term strategies. Because if they are not part of that process, if we're not looking at the macroeconomic impacts and all these data that are also applicable to the implementation, it's going to be very hard. So making sure that the costing is properly included, we have the macroeconomic impacts, we have that data, and we have the Ministry of Finance integral part of the next round. That is, we think, is very much necessary, and through the coalition, we're going to facilitate that, working with our partners. So I think that is mostly from the coalition, just echoing the minister's point on capacity. We also see that the reality on the ground is many ministries of finance actually have very limited climate capacities. So how do we also make sure we strengthen working with the partners, that not just it's experts coming in, but it's also the expertise being embedded in the ministry, so that the ministries themselves strengthen the climate capacity so that they can take it forward in their policies, really more integral to their mission. So that's something that we need to work on together very much to make this happen.
Fantastic. So Stefan, final question then. I'd like you to ask you the same question as Bert. What can the World Bank do to address the data gap situation and support countries to develop data that can support climate policy?
So, I mean, my first response would be by listening first, and it's really great, Minister, to have you here talking about your needs, because, I mean, we're a demand-led organization, right? So the first thing to do is go talk to the people making the decisions, understand what are the decisions, in what condition do they do the decisions, what do they need to do it, and only then we can identify those needs. And you realize it's very granular. Like, there are no two decisions alike, right? Sometimes it's a rush, sometimes we have more time. So I would start by this process of really co-designing the data depending on the decision we need to make. I wanted to use one example, which is, you might have heard that we have a new mission, which is ending poverty on a livable planet. And of course, if you have a new mission, you need new indicators to try to track your progress on this. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to think about how we can better measure progress on resilience. And if you want to do that, you need to combine a lot of data coming from very different places. You need geographic data coming from weather agencies and IPCC and so on about the risks themselves. You need to know where the people live. You need to know how the people live, in what type of buildings, what type of occupations. And the key challenge is to bring all of that together. And so in that case, you realize the challenge, because we're in a rush in that case, is not too much to create new data, but it's really an integration challenge. And I can invite you, we just published a few days ago a paper on counting the number of people highly vulnerable or like at high risk of climate change, to try to look with the data we have, what can we do, what can we say? And that's because we're in a rush. But in the same time, we're working with statistical agencies so that household surveys that we do on the ground are better designed to capture resilience. They have been designed to capture poverty, not resilience, so we have to adjust them. But that's going to take years, right? So we have this kind of two tracks, something with the data we have, with the limitation that we have to do with the data we have, and a longer-term track where we try to improve data collection so that we can better answer those questions. So never one answer, but coming back to my first point, we need people like you who know what are the decisions we want to inform and listen to your needs.
Oh, fantastic, thank you very much. So I think we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience, and we've got one here. Do we have a mic? So we'll just get the mic, and then we've probably got time for one more as well, so we'll start here. Oh, is it?
Hello?
Oh, there we go.
So much. Sorry.
It works.
With permission from Madam Minister, I would like to add a few things. I'm Samba Thiam. I'm a roving ambassador in the government of Mauritania. I'm former staff member, IMF, for 25 years. On the slide that you presented first, I know that the RSF is not a climate finance per se, but it was not on the list of things that we could use as an opportunity to really fill the gap. And I'm going to say why. In terms of Ministry of Finance implication, our program has two main components. One is identifying climate expenditure related, and this is something that we have embedded in our RSF program. The second one is the selection of investment program based on climate conditions. We are very lucky to have a very good social database for targeting in Mauritania. Of course, it needs to be improved because you want to know if the person you have identified is really a real beneficiary or something would deserve to be subsidized for one reason or another. But it has been one of the tools we will use during the RSF program to make sure that those who are impacted by climate effect will get compensation somehow. The other component that we have, which is very important, is on subsidies and the introduction of a carbon tax. Subsidies to whom and subsidies to what level? I think it's very important to have the data to decide. And this is really where we expect a lot of technical assistance from the World Bank, from the IMF. The two last component, one is on the identification of groundwater resource, as Madam Minister was saying on the wetland, but also groundwater resource to make sure that we are not wasting, we're using to good use. And the last one with decarbonization of the economy through the mining companies and how the carbon tax will impact them if there is a double taxation and so on. So just I wanted to say that the RST will be a very good opportunity for eligible countries to close the gap on data missing. Thank you.
Okay, maybe there's a question here that you can respond to. Unless any of you, did you have any comments in response there to the ambassador? Okay, we'll just go for the question.
Well, thank you. I'm Barry Mart from Rabobank. So, but my question is to Bert. Bert, one of the things on your climate change indicators dashboard, what I really would urge IMF and the World Bank is to set one standard so that all DFIs would actually follow the same standard. I have hundreds of people working at Rabobank trying to figure out all the different reporting, data, compliance on climate. So it would be great if the IMF and the World Bank could lead that all this data is one and that we only did one reporting.
So what do you make of the suggestion?
Well, I'd like to take on big hats, but this is a really big hat. Now, what we try to do, together with all the other international institutions and basically countries in the world, to have joint definitions of these green finance instruments, these subsidies that came up with numerous thousand expenditures, so we have the same statistics that underlie macroeconomic policies and financial stability policies. That's our work. Obviously, we talk to regulator authorities to ensure we align with them, because it's good for us if it is that the case, because then we can use that data, and the other round we have benchmark information they can use, so we have contact with these regulatory information. We're not the ones who are setting standards for individual companies or individual banks. But common standards are incredibly important, and on statistical way we really not only contribute but try to lead the way to ensure we have that. And now I have the floor. I see your point on RST, and I also take the earlier point that the minister made. This is a huge task for IMF, World Bank and other organizations to work together to ensure that in the end you do not have 3 or 4 different numbers anymore for wetlands, but we align our estimates and we also align our capacity development work, and we're more than happy to do that on the topics that you do, the World Bank, us together, to ensure we really help the countries with the needs that you have.
Yeah, I would like to thank Samba for bringing this point and highlighting the fact that Mauritania has starting to benefit from the world of the work of World Bank and IMF thanks to the RST. It has been a useful journey for us to learn about how IMF works and how they shifted to climate finance, and it's important. And it has been a good training for our teams also, because many different ministries have to work on the RST, and I think it's very important for us in terms of communication to see, okay, if the IMF now is taking the environmental issue, the climate issue, on the center of his financing, it's important that we in Mauritania, the different ministries, work together to make sure that in every budget, every plan that you have the environmental, dimension. And this is it's been a very good work, and we are working on that, and there's a lot of good things that we hope that will come from the RST.
Great. I think we've got time for one very quick question. So does anyone have a very quick question? Is you putting your hand up, or have you trying to give the mic away? Okay, I'll ask a quick question then. To the whole panel, what is the most important bit of data you wish you have and you don't have? Just one very short answer, if you wouldn't mind. Starting with you, Stefan.
Being the first is more difficult than being the last. I would say what we would need is the geographical information on where people live, to just connect who lives where and is exposed to what. At the moment, we have these two things separated and they are not speaking to each other.
Great, thank you. Minister Kamara?
Yeah, I'll say really, again, collaboration, and really make sure that we understand each other, that we are very clear on our objective before we start to work.
Ms. Beckett?
The impact on the policy implementation of the data.
Okay, and finally, Bert.
capacity for countries to make all these data that is so important. They're not free, but they're very important.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you go away with a new appreciation for the importance of data and what we don't know. And thank you very much to my panel for joining us today. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.